communicate with people, get off of your devices and start making human connections and network with people. I knew I was a troublemaker when men were paying attention to me for all the wrong reasons. And that is that for a long time, I kind of hid out almost at baseball parks. Again, I'm going to go back to the 20s because in my 20s, in the 1970s, when I was truly stirring up trouble for baseball. The pattern up until when I arrived is that women showed up to write about baseball, but they didn't stay around. They left pretty quickly. And part of the reason is that the men were quite effective at curtailing their capacities to do the job that they had come to do. Just for a little bit of a brief history, I mean, back in the late 50s, early 60s, when women showed up at baseball parks, they weren't allowed to go on the field, which is traditionally where men went, the male sports writers went before the game to talk to the players when they were taking batting practice. But the women were confined behind the grandstands and not allowed in most ballparks to sit in the press box. And so most of the women who came and went at that point maybe did a story and then they were gone. They didn't stay around. So I think it empowered the men to say, well, if we just keep making it difficult for them to do this job, maybe they'll just leave like all these women are doing. And then you get to the early 70s, you have a woman named Diane Shaw who is assigned again in September to come to Fenway Park in Boston for a series. And she calls the Red Sox, which is what you do as a reporter. And she says, I'm coming up. I would like the credentials so that I can do my story when I get to Fenway Park. And the very curmudgeonly older PR guy, Bill Crowley, who looked at it as his role to quote unquote protect his players from the invasion of women, told Diane, fine, I'll give you a seat in the grandstand. You won't have a seat in the press box because that's controlled by the writers and they don't want women in the press box, etc. So Diane then called upon her managing editor, who was a man, and the lawyer for her magazine to call the Red Sox and demand that she be given the same credentials as the men. But at that point, no one was really thinking about locker rooms because there was so much else. We were still trying to just get on the field and in the press box. So that was in 1972. Well, Diane did get access to the field. She did get access, a seat in the press box, but what they didn't tell her, and how would the managing editor and lawyer even think that this was the case? When they walked her up to the press box, they escorted her up there and she went in as though she was going to eat her pregame meal, because you always had a pregame meal at all of these games. And she walked as though she was going to go in and eat it with the men. And in fact, she was informed that no, she couldn't eat with the male sports writers. I mean, heaven forbid. Again, I don't think any of them were naked, but, I doubt it. They had set up a tiny little picnic table for her on the top of the roof of Fenway Park, right next to where the dining room was. And it had on a sign that said Ladies Pavilion. And it turned out later on, when I started doing research for my book, that this was the same pattern that was being used at that time for probably the only other woman who was covering baseball at the time, a woman named Anita Martini, who was a broadcaster down in Houston. And they would bring her tray of food to her, and she would sit apart from the men and eat it. So that was in 72. In 73, the woman who held my job up until 1975, when she left and I then was made the junior baseball reporter, woman named Stephanie Salter, was given a ticket by one of the men at Sports Illustrated to attend the annual Baseball Writers Annual Gala. And it turned out that it was a men's only affair, stag. And they claimed later that it was stag because the performance that they would do in a dress up would be too difficult for women to watch. It would be too, awful for them to have to listen to the kind of jokes that the men would be telling. So Stephanie went to the dinner. She made a tux as best she could out of a black dress and a little tie around her neck. And she had barely finished her fruit bowl and was into her soup when three different men had to approach her and escort her out of the gala because no woman could be allowed to be in it. So this is 1973. So then I've told you about 1976. So it's just to get an overall characterization. So when I arrive as the reporter at Sports Illustrated who is showing up for every single baseball game. This is why I say I didn't have time to get involved in the women's movement, because I would be at the office in the day and then I would either be at Yankee Stadium or the Shea Stadium, depending on which of the teams was in town. But I was at a ball game every single night and on some of the weekend games. So I was just showing up. And I'd never reported baseball, so I had to learn. So I just kind of hung out and watched how the men did it. I listened how they did it. I started trying to mimic how they did it. I tried to figure out, how I would approach a manager as opposed to a man approaching a manager. It took me a long time to kind of learn the rules of the road. But I think that when I understood that I was a troublemaker was probably not, this is going to surprise people, but probably not until Roger Angell wrote the story Sharing the Beat in the New Yorker, which he wrote in conjunction with my legal case. That story came out in early April of 1979. And in that story, he quotes at length a lot of people, including Diane Shaw, talking about her experience in 1972, myself, other women. But it's really when he quotes from the men. And it's really the first time that I hear directly from the men about how much they really hated me and hated having me there. And the things they sort of said about me, at that time, it was really kind of discourteous, and a man had to have a byline or his picture on the column. There wasn't the anonymity that there is today of social media. So the kind of language, the kind of threats, the kind of, visceral dislike and, real hatred almost that comes out now routinely against women who cover sports. I was kind of insulated from it because of the need for a person who was writing about me or talking about me to identify themselves by name. And that had a civilizing impact. But it really sort of stunned me the level at which they really didn't want me as a representation of women to be around what they considered their game. And they were very fearful about what my presence and what my continued presence, that I had refused to not be there, even if they didn't speak to me very much, even if they, kept me out of the locker rooms, which at that point I believed was the next realm to go. And they were adamant about keeping me out. It just, it wasn't as unpleasant for me in the day to day because I just loved the fact that I was doing a job that I loved. And so I overlooked a lot of the discomfort that I felt. But when those words were in print and sort of directed at me, I think that was when I really realized how much of a troublemaker people really thought I was.